Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and AP English, and we turn now to our study of Goethe's Faust. Maybe the greatest work of literature ever created. I see some of you already smiling. You knew I was going there. Without question, this is really one of the stories that is so important to 303. Think of it this way. If it's true, what we've been saying ever since the beginning of our time together as AP students, if it's true that we are, in fact, the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, and really important in a text like this, the stories we reject, then this probably is one of the texts that in many ways defines our conversations in 303. It's in many ways a culminating moment when you look at where we've been, beginning, of course, with the great authors that we've already studied, beginning, of course, with Homer and Virgil, on through our study of Plato, and then into Dante and our study of the Divine Comedy, and then, of course, Shakespeare and our study of Milton and Paradise Lost. Finally, we come now to the great Romantic writer Goethe, and in this moment, really, we find ourselves working with one of the greatest of these synthetic visionaries. He brings everything preceding to him together, and in some just remarkable ways is able to then build for the future. And of course, you can't really talk about modernity and postmodernity or post-postmodernity without talking about the great Faust. So we're here now with Faust. At the very beginning, I feel really, more than in any other lectures that I've shared with you guys, I feel incumbent upon me to admit my debt to so many important theorists over the years who have helped me. But I want to really call out and name one of my dear colleagues, Kevin Tonkovich, who for many, many years lectured alongside me here at Worland High School and has recently retired and gone on to other work. And I want to say just at the beginning of this lecture how much I'm indebted to him. Great German scholar, great lover of Goethe and of Faust, and I just want to say that I will dedicate this lecture to him. Some of our students will remember him very, very fondly as one of the greatest teachers that they ever had, certainly one of the greatest colleagues and friends I ever had. And I want to dedicate this lecture to him. I am not saying, however, if there's any faults, and there will be lots and lots of faults in this lecture, that they belong to him. They all redound to me. But I just want to say to him, thank you for the life you've lived, and thank you for the passion that you had for the German language, and especially for this poem. Now, I do have some assumptions that I want to make sure that I articulate right away. Our first is that you have been following our stuff on LearnStrong.net and the AP folder. If you haven't, it would make sense that you're familiar with a number of the titles. I'll be referencing a number of titles as I go through this one. I'm also going to assume that you're familiar with our learning theory, the desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. That's certainly going to be significant in our time together here, as well as our understanding of annotative theory and our three levels of reading. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? 2A, themes, messages. 2B, here we're asking specifically about notions of the rhetorical approach, not what Goethe says, but how he says it. And namely for us, we'll look at symbolism and irony as we are often wont to do. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, other texts that I'm familiar with. Obviously, we're going to ask a whole lot about all of the texts within the AP curriculum that we've been studying. For example, I'll just give you two to think about. Think about that great love story of Aeneas and Dido. I say great, obviously tragic love story, Aeneas and Dido, and the jilted lover phenomenon. Think about Hamlet and his daisy girl Ophelia and the tragedy that, of course, is a part of the larger tragedy of Hamlet's life. You kind of need to know stuff like that to really be able to appreciate what's going on. For example, between Faust and Gretchen, and we'll get into it in a bit. As well, finally at 3B, we'll ask, and I think this is significant. I'm going to try and tie at the very end of this lecture. I'm going to try and tie us back in to another great German writer, Nietzsche, at the very end of this lecture, trying to challenge us to don't just take my word for it, or the word of a number of scholars that this is one of the greatest texts of all time. I'm going to challenge you to find some way to own this text for yourself. And the challenge will be, of course, how can I relate personally to a text like this? That's what we'll be doing at 3B. Also, our big five, as we call it in 303, obviously we're going to be paying attention to that. Questions, that is to say, the big five. What does this text, Faust, have to say to us about epistemology, what we can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the way the individual mind works, sociology, the way the collective mind works, and then finally theodicy, the question of evil in the world and pain and suffering, and what does this text have to say? Of course, you don't have to know a lot about Faust to know this is the story of a guy that sells his soul to the devil and how that works out for him. Not well for a lot of it, and then really well in other ways. We'll get to it in a moment. But we're going to be paying attention as we go through this, and certainly at the end to ask, what does this text say about all of those big five? A final assumption is that you have read this material on your own first. Always I recommend that. And then you're coming to our comments here as kind of a help, all right? That's our hope anyway. I'll be referencing a couple of different translators. The Kaufman translation is, for my estimation, one of the very best, but our school translation is the David Constantine translation, and so I'm going to be bouncing between the two, but for the most part my readings will be coming from the Constantine translation. The last thing I would say about this poem is that very much like what we said about St. Augustine's Confessions, this is a poem that teaches us how to read and the value of reading. So as we get into this poem, we'll kind of be paying attention to that. Now, we're going to do a real brief, just to give you a lay of the land. We're going to do a real brief biography, then we're going to do a brief summary, and then we're going to then do an in-depth summary, followed by the critique. This is really in large measure, of course, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and in many ways Marlowe is not the inventor of this storyline, certainly not, but he's the one that made it the most famous. What's fascinating is that scholars tell us that maybe Faust himself didn't stumble on to Marlowe's version until he was much later in Goethe's life, which is kind of fascinating. Speaking of Goethe's life, let's go to work with biography really quickly. I'm just going to do epidermal here, okay? Born 28th of August, 1749, dies the 22nd of March, 1832, lives 82 years, so he lives a long time. That'll be significant. He's famous by the age of 25. He is a polymath in almost every sense of that word. His first novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, in 1774, it's an amazing novel. I certainly recommend it to you. And he, of course, Werther made Yellow and Suicide during that storm and stress time period popular. It's an amazing text. He was an amazing scientist, an amazing politician, an amazing writer, as I said. He's a polymath. Think, and you can write this in your notes, think about Milton, think about Bacon, and some of the comments that we made about both of those guys is, from a very young age, were clearly pronounced as being just beyond everybody else. And certainly, we'll say this about Goethe. In 1790, we have just a fragment of Faust, but by 1808, write that date down, by 1808, we have the first part of Faust published, okay? It becomes a 60-year project for Goethe. And in the end, part 2 will be published in 1833 after his death, or a few months after his death. What makes Faust such an interesting text is that it's both modern, but it's also timeless. I mean, we're going to find just so much in this text as we work through it. Now, we'll talk about this as a poem, we'll talk about it as a play. It was actually performed, part 1 was performed, but really not until much later in Goethe's life, in 1829, finally it's performed, part 1. Part 2, not known as well, not appreciated as much. It's way more complicated. The German is way more complicated language. We in AP will only actually study Faust Part 1 in the same way that we only study Dante's Divine Comedy Part 1, the Inferno. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about Faust Part 2 because, much like I said about Divine Comedy, if you don't know how the text ends, you got some challenges. All right, let's go ahead and do a real brief summary now of the text Faust, Part 1 and Part 2. In Part 1, we're going to open with this little conversation in heaven. It's going to look a whole lot like the book of Job and our comments about that whole theodicy project. We're going to have a similar kind of bet. We're going to meet Faust. We're going to see him as a scholar who is kind of plagued with ennui. That will be our key word, that French word boredom, extreme boredom. We're going to meet Mephistopheles or Mephistio, the devil incarnate in some way. Okay, we're going to have a bet that will be understood between, in some ways, and a wager that's understood between Mephistio and Faust. If Faust ever says, "Stay moment, thou art so fair," then Mephistopheles has his soul. Faust will then be turned 30 years younger by Mephistopheles. He will seduce the young Gretchen. Marguerite is her other name. Marguerite Gretchen is her more common name. And in the process of doing so, he will abandon her. She will have a brother named Valentine, who Faust will kill with Mephistopheles' help. And ultimately Margaret will kill herself and the child that Faust has impregnated her with, and that will be the conclusion of part one. Part two is the continuation of Faust's adventures. Ultimately, for example, he stumbles onto Helen, and then ultimately he will die. Right before he dies, however, he is redeemed by God, and the notion here is that the eternal feminine leads us aloft, or leads us along that the last words of Faust. His striving will win his redemption, I suppose, is a way for us to think of that. So let's now turn to the poem itself. Think about dates, just to give you a sense of where we've been and where we're going. Think of it: 1300 Dante and Chaucer, right? 1600 we have Hamlet. 1667 we've got Milton and Paradise Lost being published. And now, roughly 1800, I mean, that's a good working round date. You have Goethe working on this classic text. Let's go through it. I'm going to be following again the pattern that we've used in prior conversations. I'm just going to walk you through this thing, and we'll go kind of methodically through it. I recommend that you're taking notes. Obviously, I hope that you're reading this with me. Now, scholars have noted that this poem can easily be divided up into a number of parts. Goethe himself will divide it up into parts, and that's kind of the way that I'm going to follow it, starting with the dedication here in a second. I wish, and I mean this, I wish that I had the time to be able to read all of this with you, or a good chunk of this with you, because it is amazing. I just don't have the time, so I'm going to dip in at moments and I'll read with you. And again, my page numbering here, with the exception of my Kaufman reading at the very beginning of the actual poem, will all come from our text, the Constantine title. We begin with the dedication, and we've got a really short poem where Goethe is going to describe some of his own thoughts about the poem that he wants to construct, which in the end will, of course, take him a period of some 60 years to write, right? He will see the ghosts that have haunted him. We might think about those forms from Plato's Republic, and he's in a somewhat tranquil, sad, almost melancholy mood. But there is a resolved determination to tell the story. The last words: "What I possess looks far away to me. Things vanished are becoming my reality." And in this moment, we kind of recognize that, you know, there's a challenge here, no question, for Goethe to put together something like this. We then move to a prelude in the theater. This is all preceding, okay? And this is a discussion between a director, a poet, and a clown. And the question is, what makes a great play? This is a fascinating question, okay? Now, the director will say, we need to make money. So obviously action and novelty are important. The poet will say that artistry and ideas are important. That is to say, make the play universal. And it will be the clown who will say that these views can coexist. And of course here we have some of the essential themes of the poem itself. The poet is emphasizing the individualist, right, and eternal values. The clown is the realist and therefore practical. The director, of course, somehow wanting to combine the two, and in many ways, like Faust, wanting to combine the two. The director's final comments are about stagecraft and to impress us with Goethe's knowledge of drama as well. One of the great lines from this one is, old age doesn't make us childish, as they say. It finds the true surviving child in us. We think about T.S. Eliot in his 4 quartets, old men ought to be explorers, the similar kind of line. We move now to the prologue in heaven. Now this is huge, write it in your notes. Goethe is going to draw from a lot of different traditions literarily, and one of those will of course be biblical, no question. And here we'll have the prologue in heaven, which is going to look a whole lot like the book of Job. And we're going to have God there with all the angels, and Satan, Mephistopheles, will also show up. This is going to be another theodicy. The question will be, why do we have evil or suffering in a world created by an all-powerful, all-loving deity? Of course, we messed around with that a number of times in AP, but most importantly in our Milton's Paradise Lost discussion. The three angels are the archangels, and immediately we think of our Milton here, Raphael, Gabriel, and Michael, and they sing songs of worship, so that when Mephistopheles shows up, he will have immediately, well, there's a beautiful kind of character that's drawn here. If Milton's Satan is a remarkable creation, Mephistopheles is kind of taking Milton on steroids, and in that regards, listen to the very first lines. He says it, as the angels have been singing, "Since, Lord, you join our company again, and ask how all things in our circle do, and use delight to see me on occasion, you find me here among the servants too. Forgive me, I can't lift my language high enough, and will be sneered at here for that, no doubt. Pathos from me would surely make you laugh, were laughter not a thing you've learned to do without." Notice the suggestion that for Mephistopheles that God doesn't have much of a sense of humor, if you will, right? Mephistopheles will then say that because he lacks this skill of singing, but he has noticed something about us humans. Reason, he says, seems to make us unhappy. God will then say, we'll look at Faust, the way that the book of Job says, look at Job, and he says that men make mistakes as long as they strive. And then we'll have this wager that will happen, where Mephistopheles will say about Faust, "Indeed, his way of serving you is odd. His meat and drink are not the earthly sort. The ferment in him drives him ever further. He's half aware that he is raving mad. From heaven he wants the fairest star, and from the earth then every highest pleasure. And all things near and all things far can't satisfy his foolish, deeply agitated heart." When we meet Faust here in a moment, we're going to see that this is exactly the case. But the Lord will respond, "What if he serves me in confusion now? Soon I shall lead him into clarity," predicting the end. "A gardener knows the leafing, nursing tree with bloom and fruit will grace the years that follow." Now, this is an amazing reference to a whole reference to a whole lot of other things. We, of course, think of the Garden in Eden of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit. We obviously think about Milton's Paradise Lost. But we also think about our texts like Hamlet, right? Remember that Hamlet will say in that very first soliloquy that the world is an unweeded garden. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. Notice here we're back to the garden theme. And we're going to see gardens, in fact, in the poem a number of times as well. And then we'll have the wager itself, the bet, right? Who will win in the end. We learn from the angel songs, the only absolute sin is non-action. Put this in your notes. This is one of the central teachings of Faust. The only sin is to forget, right? It's an interesting way to think about sin. The striving, the struggle is the key. Put that in your notes. Mephistopheles will repeat the spirit that he will say he's the spirit of negation. God will say that man has an innate will for good, and sin is a forgetting as part of human growth. Here, note the difference, right, between the book of Job in the Bible, where Job will simply blindly accept fate as necessary. Here, we have man is free to err, man is free to strive, and in the process will be redeemed. And then Faust's struggle, we should point out here, is going to become cosmic. All humans have to go through this, and to that degree, Faust becomes kind of every man, we might say. The questions, of course, here abound. Are humans important? And what about the struggle makes pain meaningful? And why is that the case? The theodicy question, right? Now notice, we haven't even begun the poem yet, guys, and we still see how much territory that Goethe is covering, right? Few texts in 303 that we study have this ability. We now turn to the text itself and to the actual poem and then to the play. Enough of the preambulation and the beginning stuff, and we're ready now to go to work with it. We're going to meet Faust. He's a scholar. He's bored. We think of Baudelaire's The Reader. We think, go back to that one in our Joyce lecture, that notion that I know everything and so I know nothing. We're in a narrow vaulted Gothic chamber. Faust is surrounded by his books and our first image of him, and it's important to put it in your notes, it's Easter Eve. Think about the possibility of resurrection, think about the phoenix mythology as well. I'm going to begin with the Kaufman translation. We don't have the Kaufman translation for all of the reading, but I am going to begin here. Faust, very first words. I have, he says, alas, studied philosophy, jurisprudence, and medicine too, and worst of all, theology, with keen endeavor through and through. And here I am, for all my lore, the wretched fool I was before, called Master of Arts and Doctor to boot. For 10 years almost I confute, and up and down wherever it goes, I drag my students by the nose, and see that for all our science and art, we can know nothing. Now, this is, of course, one of the great images of, he says, I've learned everything, and I'm this amazing teacher, and I drag my students around by the nose. Some of you smiling because, of course, this is a great line about what teachers sometimes have to do. No question, put it at 3A. We're already thinking about Plato's Republic, Book 7, and the cave allegory, and that being dragged out into the light of the sun, the teacher doing that, and our need to overcome fear and pain. Notice here, though, there's a level of cynicism. He says, we can't know anything. It burns my heart, he says. Of course, I am smarter than all the shysters, the doctors and teachers and scribes and Christers. No scruple nor doubt could make me ill. I'm not afraid of the devil or hell. Ironic, right? But therefore, I also lack all delight. Do not fancy that I know anything right. Do not fancy that I can teach or assert what would better mankind or what might convert. In other words, I know everything, I don't know anything. I also have neither money nor treasures nor worldly honors nor earthly pleasures. No dog would want to live longer this way. Now, this idea of not wanting to live longer is, of course, very much sounding like Hamlet. The fact that he mentions dogs in philosophy takes us, of course, back to Plato and to the Republic. Remember, he said that when they learn dialectic, they're like little puppies biting on each other's ears. Dogs are, of course, going to come back again. We're going to see a poodle here in a little bit that will be, in fact, Mephistopheles himself, right? So, let's put it in our notes. Faust. Well, what is he? 50.